Why don't we all just give the good people of Ellen a little wave? You don't stand up, just kind of maybe turn around, say hi, there you go, hello. It will always be ridiculous, this part of the service. Doesn't matter how, yeah, okay. So we, last week, started a series in the book of Titus, and we're just doing that over the summer. I don't know, how many of us have ever heard a series of sermons on the book of Titus? One of us. Brilliant. Okay, well, perhaps you should be doing the series. Anyway, we've got to Titus chapter 1, verse 5. So that's where we're going to read from. It will come up on the screen as well. And this is the Apostle Paul speaking. The reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man, interesting, whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what's good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it's been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Amen. So what we're going to do this morning, as briefly as I can, although I will warn you, I've gone on to a 5th page this morning, that's never a good sign, is just look at 3 things that Paul's example teaches us. Such a remarkable Christian leader, Christian man. What does he teach us in this passage? And the first thing is this. We're going to notice Paul's expansive vision. I know a bunch of people have joined our church over the last few months, and that's brilliant, and we're really glad to have you with us. You have joined a church that meets in many places, and probably you've already figured that out. And it's not really up for grabs. That is just kind of what you've joined. That's sort of, it is what it is. But the truth is that for most of us here probably who were around before that, it might not necessarily have been our choice. In fact, we did everything we possibly could to try and be one church that meets in one place. And when I say everything we possibly could, for example, we employed an architect. He drew up plans to knock down this wall and to build a whole church again, kind of mirroring this one. And we got planning permission, and then it turned out it was going to be ridiculously expensive. And actually, the truth is that we would have already filled it, and so that would have been awkward, wouldn't it? And so we kind of scrapped that idea, and then we tried to buy a casino, and we failed. And then we tried to buy a warehouse the other side of Union Square, and we failed. And then we tried to buy a disused church, and we failed. And you can kind of see the running picture. And in the end, I think we all found ourselves just saying, Lord, please will you speak? Please will you show us what to do, because this is getting ridiculous. And it just happened that there was a church down the road that wasn't being used on a Sunday, a building, and so we just said, would you mind if we just borrowed it for a while on Sundays? And I don't know anyone else, but I don't think many of us thought it was going to be a permanent fixture. But actually, in that kind of process, I know that we began to hear God speak about, do you know what, this is a way to reach a whole region for Christ. This is a way to spread out as a church and just put the gospel in front of as many people as possible. And so in the end, I think it was something like 26 individual prophetic words. That some of them were really recent, some of them were going back 20 years, kind of bringing real clarity, and we knew actually this is what we had to do. And so as a church, we've been trying to walk in obedience to that call, in a sense. And there was a moment just coming up for 2 years ago where we as a church had to provide the money to make this thing happen. And we just put a big basket on the front of the stage here. It was one of the most special days in the life of this church. Just whole families coming up, holding hands together with their pledges and their envelopes, and just dropping it in and saying a little prayer and stepping away. And then we took this basket. Now, in hindsight, this might not have been the most secure thing to do, but I just took the basket and I legged it down the road to Leadside Church where we were, and then we did it all again, and then we did it again in the evening. And in that one day, people in this church pledged to give and gave £441,500 in one day, which is just extraordinary. And actually, if you're still giving, I know lots of us are now fulfilling those pledges that we made. And actually, very few people have stopped doing that, which is fantastic. And so please don't stop. Please keep doing that, because it's the fuel for what we're trying to do as we walk in obedience to God. And so that enabled us then to press on, and so we started a site in Stonehaven last January, and then one in Ellen, and one in St. Macca Academy, and then in a few weeks' time we're going to lay hands on a whole new group of people who are going to go out to Inverurie Way, which we're really, really excited about. It's a great team, quite a big team actually, kind of forming to go and do that thing, which we're really excited about. And as a leadership team, we're absolutely convinced that this is what God is asking us to do. There's no question. It's like, Lord, you are so in this. But if I'm completely honest, I think I have two voices in my head most of the time, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels like this. On the one hand, there's a voice that says, do you know, this is amazing. This is just the kindness of God. This is just extraordinary. What God's doing is so perfect, so beautiful, so amazing. I think, just as I was counting up the other day, we know that at least 43 people have come to faith in the life of our church this year so far, which is just so exciting. So in the one hand, there's that voice, and then on the other hand, there's the voice which says, don't you think this is all a bit ambitious? You know, isn't this a bit ridiculous? Who do you think you are, you and your little church? This is a little bit further than what you're capable of. I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels like that. And so, as I've been immersing myself in this passage and in this book over the last week or two, I've just been so encouraged by the scale of Paul's vision. Because it is actually amazing how far Paul went, the lengths that Paul went to communicate the gospel to as many people as possible. So we know, by this point in New Testament history, we know that he had preached the gospel in Damascus, Jerusalem, Tarsus, Antioch, Cyprus, Pamphylia, Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Syria, Cilicia, Phrygia, Galatia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Greece, Caesarea, Malta, and Rome. He has gone to the ends of the earth almost. He's set his face towards, I must do this. I must put the gospel in front of as many people as possible. There must be an expression of church in as many places as possible. Preaching the gospel, planting churches, strengthening churches, raising up leaders, serving the Lord. And in all of that was happening not in today's global culture where Facebook and Twitter and EasyJet are kind of bringing us all closer together. This is in ancient Near Eastern culture where most people who'd ever lived on the face of the planet rarely left their own village, let alone went to another town or another region or another nation. And the book of Acts finishes with Paul under house arrest in Rome and waiting for an audience with Caesar. And it seems like at some point after that, maybe 2 years later, he was released from prison in Rome. And then what did he do? He just pressed on again. And as a result of visiting even more places after all the ones that I just mentioned, he found himself in Crete. And the presumption is that he met a whole bunch of people who'd been come to faith at Pentecost. So remember, on the day of Pentecost, there were people from loads of different nations, including, it says, Acts chapter 2, verse 11, people from Crete. And so maybe they went back to their hometown, and then Paul found those people when he visited there, started to preach the gospel, started to build a church, and this church starts to be raised up. And then it's just kind of nearing something that looks like a church. He leaves Titus there, and he moves on to the next place. Do you hear his heart? It's like, I have to do whatever I can to put the gospel in front of as many people as possible. In fact, it says in verse 5 that the job won't be finished until there are elders, not just in Crete, but in every town in Crete, or on Crete, I should say. It's like, I just have to do this. I have to do this. And of course, where does that heart come from? It comes from the heart of God. You know, Jesus, Matthew 28, I want you to go to all people groups and make disciples and baptize them and teach them. He's saying there needs to be an expression of church amongst all the people of the earth. So we might well ask ourselves tough questions, and the enemy might well be nipping in our ears saying, who do you think you are? But anything within us that is saying we have to go to more people, we have to try more things, we have to risk more things, we have to go to more places to preach the gospel to as many people as possible, any heart like that surely finds its origin in the heart of God. So obviously we pray for the blessing of, God's blessing on a whole bunch of other churches, all of the churches in this region, and we hope that they grow and they expand and they spread out and they plant churches and all of that. But we have to play our part, because God's vision is for a vibrant, full of life church bearing witness to Jesus in every community on the face of the earth. That's the first thing, Paul's expansive vision. The second thing, Paul's faithfulness to God's call. Taryn and I, actually Taryn is at St. Macca this morning, but we've had a great summer with our kids, and we went on holiday for a little bit, and then we went to Soul Survivor in Inverurie, and then we went to Soul Survivor in Stafford, and she'll be mortified that I told you this. But, in Stafford, she spoke on the main stage at Soul Survivor A to 4,000 people. I was so proud of her. Oh, I'm going to cry. It was amazing. Anyway, the point is we've been hanging out with our kids a lot, and the hilarious thing is they've been talking a lot about what they want to do when they grow up. And every few days it's changed, because they kind of embrace a whole new idea and a whole new sense of vocation. And then within a few days, they've realized all of the flaws in that plan. And so they're like, no, why would any loser want to do that? No, it's the last thing I want to do. I want to go and do something even more exciting. And I love that children have an innate sense that their whole lives are a white blank page in front of them. And that they want to spend their lives doing something that they love and that has meaning and purpose. And so often we lose that. It seems to me that we can figure out what we're for, our sense of purpose and meaning, in one of three different ways. The first one is we just do what everyone else expects us to do. I'll never forget when our first child was born, Kaya, our eldest son, about 11 years ago. We desperately wanted to bring our newborn baby to our church family and to have a kind of a Lion King moment. This is what we've produced. And we're very excited about that. And I was standing in the coffee queue, and this guy comes up to me, and he starts pointing at the baby in the buggy next to me and just saying, oh, he's got your hair, and funny jokes like that, ha ha ha. He really looks like you, he's like mini-me and all this kind of stuff. And as he went on, I just said, look, I'm going to have to stop you here, because actually that's not my baby. My baby's over there. From our first breath, people are telling us who we are and projecting on us their perception of our identity. And if we're not careful, we end up living out our lives with our sense of identity and our sense of purpose being what other people project on us rather than what we're really for. The second way that we figure out what we're for is trial and error. And probably that's what most of us do. We just try a whole bunch of things and we find out what we're good at. That's the theory. We find out what we're good at. Most of us end up just finding out what we're bad at. It's kind of a serial disaster, serial failure. No, it turns out I'm not going to be a Premiership footballer. Turns out I'm not going to be a rugby player either, or a rower, or a table tennis player, or a chess player, or, we kind of go through life just figuring out what we're not good at. Well, do you know the wonderful thing about what we discover in the pages of Scripture is that all of the heroes of the Bible don't get their sense of identity or their sense of vocation from what other people say they should be, or by trial and error, but by meeting God and then receiving a call from God. And so you could look at Abraham, for example. There's Abraham. He has this encounter with God, and God says, I want you to leave your country and your father's household and all of that, and I want you to go to a place that I'm going to tell you where it is, and then I'm going to make you into a great nation. Or Moses has this encounter with God at the burning bush, and God says, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt, therefore go. Or Isaiah has this extraordinary encounter with God in Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and all of that stuff. And Isaiah says, here I am, send me. And God says, yeah, I am sending you. And you've got to give these words to these people. And it happens in the New Testament as well, doesn't it? The disciples, they meet Jesus. There they are, fishing. And Jesus says, come, follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men. And they know they've met Jesus, they've met God, and they have to go. So many of us struggle with, what am I for? And there may well be a bunch of people here who are just saying, I just don't know what to do with my life. Maybe even if your life feels like it's more than halfway through. I want to spend my life well. And the teaching of Scripture is, a call from God comes from an encounter with God. And certainly you see that in the Apostle Paul. You know, the Apostle Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus says, I'm Jesus, who you've been persecuting. Now get up and go into the town, and I'll tell you what to do next. And then as a result of a whole series of encounters with God, he gets this call to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. That's his call. What I've been so struck with in this passage and in this book is how faithful he is to the call of God on his life. What does faithfulness look like? First of all, it means staying focused. Throughout Paul's letters, he repeats again and again and again, I am called to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. He says it, I counted 6 times just by flicking through. I'm sure it's more than that. And then often as well, on top of that, he gives little hints of, I'm called to be an apostle, or I'm called to be a servant of God, or I'm called to preach the gospel. So for example, Galatians 2 verse 7, he says, I've been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised. Romans 11:13, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry. Ephesians 3:8, although I am less than the least of all the Lord's people, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the boundless riches of Christ. Do you see? He's crystal clear. He knows what he's for. And then he repeats it as often as he can. And the great thing about knowing what you're for is that you also know what you're not for. And so you don't end up doing a whole bunch of things that you're not called to do, that God is calling somebody else to do. And that's why Paul is able to say, I'm leaving you, Titus, to appoint elders, because I'm going off somewhere else to preach the gospel somewhere else. Do you see? He knows that he's called to preach the gospel. And if he'd have stayed around and just said, well, I'll just stick around here for a while and just invest in these people, he would have robbed Titus of the opportunity to do what God was calling him to do. And so we need to be so careful that we have absolute clarity and focus on what God is asking us to do and what he's asking us not to do, or what he's not asking us to do. Faithfulness requires focus. The other thing is, faithfulness requires urgency, a sense of urgency. You know, so often, Christians are like normal people, only we just move in slow motion. You know, it's like, probably in your workplace, in BP or Shell or something like that, probably someone just makes a decision to paint the room. You know, we need to get the decorators in, we'll paint the room, we'll choose a colour. Churches and Christians don't generally do that. What we do is we say, let's form a committee. And then we have a committee meeting and we say, really needs a subcommittee, doesn't it? Yeah, subcommittee. Let's send the decision to the subcommittee. Subcommittee goes away, comes back to the committee. We've chosen the colour. Committee doesn't like the colour. Back to the drawing board, subcommittee. Away you go. Back to 3 years later, we're still wondering what the colour is going to be of the room. I love that Paul doesn't even wait for the church on Crete to be finished. He's like, I've done enough. I can go. I'm living with a sense of call to preach the gospel to as many people as possible. I'm just going to go. it'd probably be all right. Titus is a good guy. I'll leave him here. I'll go. And the other thing about faithfulness is he's faithful because he never gives up. I don't know about you, I would absolutely forgive Paul for just putting his feet up. You know, he's been preaching the gospel for several decades, and it hasn't been easy. It's been very fruitful, but it's come at a huge personal cost. And you can read about some of those personal costs in 2 Corinthians 11. He says this, I've worked much harder. I've been in prison more frequently. I've been flogged more severely and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea. I think we get the general idea. In danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. It's like I've paid so much cost. And so, having spent at least 4 years in various kinds of prison, you could easily expect him to just say, do you know what, I've had enough. I'm done. I've tried to be faithful. I've preached the gospel a lot of times. Somebody else's turn now. But instead, on immediate release from prison, he's like, I've got a few more years maybe. Let's go. He never gives up. I don't know whether there are people here and it's like, Lord, I know what you called me to do, but it's been too hard. Or I'm just too weary. Or I've just been doing it for so long. Surely that's enough now. Surely I can put my feet up now. Surely it's somebody else's turn. I just don't think there's such a thing as retirement from the call of God. And so maybe for some of us, we just need to hear the Lord say, don't give up. I love that little story about Winston Churchill. Do you know that story? I think it's October 1941. And he's invited as the wartime prime minister to go back to visit his old school in Harrow and to address the students in Harrow School. And this can't be completely true because you'd be really annoyed if you had the prime minister come to your school and he only said this. But this is apparently what he said. He said, never, ever, 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 ever give up. Never give up. Never give up. And supposedly that was it. I can't believe it actually was it. But Paul's faithfulness means that he doesn't give up. He doesn't hang up his boots. He carries on. He presses on. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we being faithful to God's call on our lives? And also we have to ask ourselves, as a church, are we being faithful to what God is calling us to do? That's the second thing. And the third thing is Paul's charge to Titus. Paul tells Titus, the reason I'm leaving you there is to finish the job. And what is that job? Actually, let's just stop there for a minute. Finish the job. I think that is a word to us as a church. Finish the job. Anyway, for Titus, finishing the job means appointing elders in every town. And the word that's used there, that's translated as elders, is the Greek word presbyteros, from where we get the word presbyter or presbytery. And then later on in verse 7, he uses another word, which is clear he's meaning to talk about the same person. It's translated as overseer, and that's the Greek word episkopos, from where we get the word bishop and episcopal and stuff like that. So he's speaking about the same person, and he's using these two leadership words interchangeably. You probably noticed that most denominations have a different setup for how they do leadership. You know, some churches have got archbishops and bishops and stuff like that. Some churches have got moderators and presbyteries, and some churches have got elders and deacons, and there are all kinds of other variations. And it would be quite nice, wouldn't it, if the New Testament gave us a bit of a clearer steer on how all that leadership stuff is supposed to work. Unfortunately, it seems to me that the New Testament leaves things kind of baggy. But the thrust of what Paul is saying is the church isn't finished until it's got leadership. And I don't know about you, I know lots of people have been hurt by church. It's quite easy to get hurt by church. Probably lots of us at various times have experienced pain as a result of just investing our heart and our soul and all of our energy into something. And when you do that and you love as much as you can, when you love, you make yourself vulnerable to being hurt. And lots of people I know have been hurt by church, and that may well be you. But I've got a bunch of friends now who say, I'm rejecting a kind of a more formal expression of church, and what I'd rather do is just do church around my dinner table. And we'll just hang out, and we'll just eat food together, and we'll pray together, and we'll open the Bible together, and that'll be that. And in one sense, I want to say, do you know what? They've got something there, that church should be highly relational, and there should be food involved, please God. But I also want to ask a bunch of questions about that from the scriptures about, is there baptism? And is there prayer and fasting? And is there the teaching of scripture? And is there sung worship? And is there serving the poor? And is there evangelism and all of that kind of stuff? But what Paul wants to tell us from this passage here is a church isn't finished unless it's got leaders. A church has always got to have leaders. Let's just notice a couple of things about the leaders that Paul is talking about. The first thing is leaders. Which one should I do first? Leadership is plural. He says, appoint elders in every town. So it's not like appoint an elder over the church in each town. He says, appoint elders, plural, in every town. Leadership is never supposed to be a one-man band or a one-woman band. It's always supposed to be team. And it's really important that you know that this church is led by an eldership. It's called the CLT. And nobody really knows what the C stands for. Some people say it's central, some people say it's core, and some people say it's church. And probably it means all of those things. But there are 7 elders in this church, and we do it together. This church is not led by one man or one couple. It's a team. And that's really important. And also, obviously, in every place where we're doing church, there are leaders exercising their ministry in team. The second thing is leaders must be open to scrutiny. I remember this past year at the Leaders Conference, John and Ellie Mumford were talking about a situation that they'd encountered in a particular church. And they were saying that they oversee over 100 churches, right? So that, these things happen. But there was a church that was going through real difficulty. And so they went along to the leadership of this church, and they started asking very private questions about, to the leaders of this church. And this one leader was very offended. And he said, what gives you the right to ask me personal questions about my personal life? And John and Ellie said, the book. You see, all of the qualifications of leadership that are in this passage are only things that you would find out if you're really scrutinizing these people very carefully, and when you're investigating not only their public persona, but their private life. So, for example, they've got to be faithful to their spouse. Not just in deed, but also in thought and in heart. They've got to have, it says in this passage, children who believe. And actually, I don't think that's a brilliant translation. I think actually a better translation would be children who are faithful. I don't think, if somebody who's in leadership has got 8 children and one of them decides to not walk with the Lord for a few years, I don't think that person is disqualified from leadership. I think actually it's more about, have they got a home life that isn't chaotic? It's in order. It has... people are being faithful and loving and kind to one another. Not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, even in the privacy of their own home on a Friday night after a long week when they're watching a video. Who watches videos these days? Anyway. Not violent, not motivated by money. How would we find out whether somebody is exhibiting those kind of things unless we're in their face? And so I just want to say, a call to leadership is a call to scrutiny, to public scrutiny. Some of the best advice anyone ever gave me was they said, avoid like the plague leaders who say that they're private people. Leadership is to be scrutinized. And the last thing, and this is probably what some of us have been waiting for, it does appear to say that eldership and leadership should be male. And so let me just talk a little bit about that, because that's slightly uncomfortable for those of us who, probably most of us in this church, who passionately believe that church is supposed to be equal opportunities. You know, that actually we believe that men and women are given gifts by God, by the Holy Spirit, and they should be free to exercise those gifts in whatever way they want. We don't actually have much time, as you can see, to go into that. So what I do want to say is that later on this year, I plan to do a proper session on this stuff, because it is really important. But let me just say this. First of all, let me say we're absolutely clear that the teaching of the whole Bible is that men and women can exercise leadership in the church. And we're completely not ambiguous about that. But let me make a few comments about this passage. The first thing is, in this passage, in the Greek, there are no male pronouns. So even though in this translation, there's the word his or the word he in verse 6, 7, 8, and 9, those pronouns are not there in the Greek. It never says he or his in the Greek. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, you see where I read, and I kind of raised my eyebrow a little bit, the second half of verse 6, a man whose children believe. That word man is not there in the Greek. It does not say a man whose children believe. It just says whose children believe. And so you might say, well, why is the NIV doing that? That sounds pretty unhelpful. Actually, what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the whole of that paragraph agree with that little statement there where it talks about his wife. Where is that? Verse 6, an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the rest of that paragraph agree with that little phrase, faithful to his wife. Actually, a whole bunch of scholars, including scholars who would say that the Bible teaches that women shouldn't be elders, would say that that little phrase there can't be used to prohibit women from being in leadership. And the reason is because they think that that was like a little figure of speech, a bit like saying, because what it actually says is, it doesn't say faithful to his wife, it says a one-woman man. That's what it says in the Greek, a one-woman man. And what they think is that that's like a little figure of speech, a bit like saying a one-horse town or a one-trick pony. It's like, you know, really it should have dashes in between, hyphens in between each word, because actually it's just a way of saying that person should be profoundly monogamous. They should just be absolutely, profoundly the opposite of promiscuous. They should have an exceptionally high view of marriage. And so what I honestly believe this passage is actually saying is, if you want to appoint someone to a position of significant leadership responsibility, you need to make sure that they're, what does it say? Blameless. And in fact, blameless is a very difficult word, isn't it? Because I'll tell you right now, there's no way that I could ever be called blameless. It's more like unimpeachable. It's like you can't hold something against them, an accusation against them. Somebody who is profoundly monogamous, especially if they're married, and somebody whose family is in good order, and someone who doesn't have too much to drink, and someone who isn't violent. You see, it's like this person has got to be exceptionally solid and living as a Christian, not only in public but also in private. So that's honestly what I believe this passage says. And so let me say now, for you girls, ladies, women who feel a call to leadership or believe that God has gifted you in leadership, let me just say this: lead on. Lead on. Let's stand, shall we? Okay, let's pray.